This video was originally posted earlier this week, but I took it down after about 24 hours because, as you'll see in the video, I photographed 3 hawk feathers that I found here in Orange County. And it was brought to my attention that in the United States, it's actually illegal to possess hawk feathers. Doesn't matter how you got them. I found mine just in some parking lots in heavily populated Orange County. I didn't take them from a nature preserve or a hike. I would never do that in a million years. But it doesn't matter how you get them, you're not allowed to have them. I, of course, didn't know that at the time. I never would have done everything you're about to see if I had known it was illegal to have these things. So I took the video down. But after thinking about it for a couple days, I decided that, I think I can bring something more positive out of this than simply brushing it under the rug. And so I'm reposting the video here with this little disclaimer to hopefully educate you about something that I personally had no idea about, which is you can't pick up hawk feathers from the ground and you can't keep them. It's an important law to help protect these species because we can't start making these feathers too valuable. People might go out and start hunting them to harvest the feathers. So please know that when you're out there. Don't pick up feathers, just look at them and keep walking. Now, I made a mistake, obviously. And I've done 3 things to hopefully remedy this mistake. Number 1 is I contacted the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and told them what I did. So I basically turned myself in. Now I'm complying with their instructions on what to do next, of course. Number 2 is I made a donation to the Ojai Raptor Center, which is a bird of prey rehabilitation center here in California that does amazing work, and I made a pretty good sized donation to them. And then finally, I am not making any money off of this video. I have demonetized it, so no ad revenue. I don't expect any sort of contributions. And as far as print sales go, I haven't made any. And going forward, I don't intend to collect any sort of profit off of print sales. So there you have it. Just be careful when you're out there, obey local laws, and don't pick up hawk feathers. So without further ado, enjoy the video. Do you ever feel like the events of your past happened just perfectly to get you to this moment where you are today? Sometimes it's on a grand scale, like being in the right place at the right time to meet your future spouse. But sometimes it's on a much smaller scale, like when you're looking for an excuse to get out of a party you don't want to go to. And just then, the bad Mexican food you ate the night before hits your lower intestine. Well, several years ago, I found a beautiful hawk's feather outside my office here. It's just laying on the ground. And I'm not the type of person to hold on to something like this. I don't really collect items, but for some reason, I felt the need to hold on to it. So I put it on my shelf and kind of forgot about it. And then, a couple years later, I find another hawk's feather, this time outside my apartment. And again, I hold on to it for some reason. And then a little bit later, right around the time I start experimenting with new 55 peel-apart film for the very first time, I find a third feather, another beautiful hawk's feather. And that's when I realized it was all coming together. A triptych began forming in my head. 1 feather on the left, 2 on the right. Shot on peel-apart film for that kind of vintage, grungy look. But I hadn't yet figured out what should be in the middle, like what should be the centerpiece of this triptych. And I wanted it to be something that would contribute to the vibe I'm trying to create here. Which the vibe I'm after is basically like mid-1800s, Great Plains of America, American Southwest, Cowboys and Indians, all that kind of stuff. But not cheesy Hollywood Cowboys and Indians, legit Cowboys and Indians. So I started thinking, well, maybe like an arrowhead. That'd be cool as a centerpiece, good symmetrical arrowhead. But I looked online and I realized pretty quick that wasn't gonna work, because they're simply too small. 4x5 film is so big that it's really hard to fill the frame with a small subject. Even if you get 1-to-1 reproduction, true macro, it's still not really gonna fill the frame. So I scrapped that idea. And I just started racking my brain, like what encapsulates that? What encapsulates that time period in America? And then I realized, the bison. Buffalo herds roaming the plains. That would make a perfect centerpiece. So I went on eBay and bought myself a bison skull. And I found this beautiful one that wasn't the cheapest thing I've ever bought, but it also wasn't as expensive as I expected. But still, it's a lot of money to spend on a prop for one photo. Good news is, it's gonna make a damn good wall piece once I'm done with it here. So that's gonna be the triptych. Feather on the left, bison skull in the middle, 2 feathers on the right, shot on new 55. I think it's gonna look pretty damn cool. Okay, so let me walk you through the plan here. The subjects are gonna be illuminated by window light. And I chose window light because a nice big window like this will create soft, feathered shadows, which I think will look good on these subjects. And in my office here, I have a bank of 4 windows that are facing northwest. Now, ideally, they'd be facing due north. Being here in the northern hemisphere, windows that face due north have very even, consistent light throughout the day. Facing northwest is going to be good enough. I just got to make sure I don't shoot too late in the afternoon when the sun's coming through the windows. And with these 4 windows, I actually have cardboard inserts I can put into the windows to control where the light's coming from. And I've put in 3 inserts to narrow the light source down to just 1 window pane. And I think that's going to be about right, but I can take out the inserts if I need a little bit bigger light source to thus soften up the shadows more. The bigger the light source is, the more feathered the shadows get. The smaller the light source is, the harsher the shadows get with harder edges. Now the subjects themselves are going to be sitting on a piece of glass here. I wanted to get them off the background so that the background would blur out a bit. But the tricky part with that is glass is very likely to give you reflections of your own camera in the background. So I went to my framer and got myself a piece of museum glass. And museum glass is normally used on artwork to provide UV protection, but the main thing is it has anti-reflective coatings on it. So I'm hoping those anti-reflective coatings are going to keep the reflections down enough that I'm not going to have to mask out my camera with a bunch of black cloth. That's going to be a nightmare, so I hope I can avoid that. And then the background I have right now is a piece of black fabric. I'm going to have to do my metering to figure out if that's too dark. I'm picturing a background that has some detail and texture to it. I don't want it pitch black. So if this has gone completely black, then I'm going to have to switch it out for a lighter cloth or maybe some craft paper crumpled up in the background. And I'm using PN 400 film instead of PN 100. I chose an ISO 400 film because this light source is actually quite dim and I don't want to push myself into ultra long exposures because then it gets into reciprocity failure and that throws another wrench in the gears. Also, PN 400 will probably have a little more grain than PN 100, which I think will actually look good on this. So I'm using my Mark II Artist Viewfinder app to figure out where I'm going to need to put my camera. I think I'm using a 210mm lens, and I'm going to have to be about right here, which ain't too bad. The bison skull, I'm going to have to get up real high, but it's not going to be too bad on these feathers. So starting off easy. Okay, so we're running into the first of, I'm sure, many difficulties. I can't get enough bellows extension to focus this close, so I'm going to have to get further back. I also realized too that as I extend the bellows, the image magnifies, so this is probably actually going to be too close anyway. So I'm going to have to go up quite a bit. Okay, that's going to be more like it, right about there. So how tall is that? Okay, maybe a foot above the step stool, something like that. Once I got the height dialed in, the next thing I had to do was level the camera perfectly. I wanted the film standard to be parallel to the subject so as to avoid any sort of perspective distortion and also to give me better control over the focus across the entire subject. Now, composing a shot like this can be tedious at times. Aside from the backbreaking nature of being hunched over your camera like this, it's just that tiny movements have such a big impact on the composition. And so this is where shifting the lens or film standard makes life a lot easier. Yeah, that looks good. Love it. It's time to figure out the metering a bit. Figure out if this background's going to work for me or if I have to go something lighter. And I'm really just trying to see the ratio of when I correctly expose for the feather. Does the background come out how I want, or is it too dark? And we're dealing with really low light levels here, so it's going to be tricky, but okay. Cool. I think the background's actually going to come out just how I want. Not pitch black, but very dark. Although, you know, I haven't really shot enough new 55 yet to feel 100% comfortable with my exposure, so I'm not really going to find out for sure until I do my first exposure. Hey, maybe I should do a Polaroid before I do my Polaroid. That doesn't make any sense. We're doing f14 at 1 second. All right, got my fixer ready. Just top these off with distilled. I have 2 wash trays now. Sam Heiser at New 55 mentioned it's not a bad idea to have a second wash tray. Not necessary, but not a bad idea either. Just when I think I have New 55 figured out, it reminds me that I shouldn't be so confident. I developed the first exposure and had a big old light leak coming from the upper left corner of the image. And that was frustrating. First exposure, off to a bad start. Now I assumed the light leak was coming from the camera, because after all, that's probably the most likely place. So I checked my camera, checked the bellows, make sure there weren't any holes in it, made sure all the parts were snug and fitting together properly, and didn't see anything out of the ordinary. So I figured, maybe it's just a fluke, so let's try it again. And the next exposure, another light leak. So I check my camera again, and there's nothing amiss on my camera. So I think maybe it's from the dark slide. When I'm pulling the dark slide out, maybe light is leaking when the dark slide is out. So I need to pull the dark slide out, fire the exposure, and put the dark slide back in as quickly as possible, and maybe that will eliminate the light leak. So I do just that. I develop another exposure, and the light leak's gone. Handled, fixed. I figured it out. And I'm feeling pretty good about myself. And actually the exposure came out great. I really like it. The background is just the right darkness. I took some wrinkles out of the back sheet there, and I think that helped the exposure. And overall, I like it a lot. One thing I really like is the Kodak logo imprints into the film, of course, but also the print gives it kind of a cool, edgy look. So I think I got it figured out. Awesome. And I'm happy with that exposure, so I move on to the double feather exposure. I place them on the glass just where they should be. I raise my camera up a little bit because it's slightly taller. I nail my focus, and this one's going to come out perfect. So I go to develop that exposure, and the light leak is back. Worse than ever. So I'm starting to get real frustrated here. I don't think it's my camera, because the last time I used my camera didn't have any light leaks. Now, of course, there's a first time for everything. Maybe the light leak just started. But there's some other reasons I think it's not the camera. Let me explain. If we look at the negative, you can see that the light leak is coming in at a very extreme angle. It's just raking across the film. And the way I can tell that is if we zoom in on the scan, you can see that there are actually granules on the film casting a shadow across the film, like a low setting sun. It's got these long shadows coming from this low light leak just streaking across the film. So that means it's obviously coming from the film sleeve, the New 55 sleeve, or my Polaroid back, or the camera back. But there's some very confusing things about those granules. First off, what the hell are those granules? Why are there granules on the film? I don't know what those granules are. I don't know where they're coming from, but they're obviously there when the light leak happens. Now, that light leak coming from an extreme corner is extra confusing because it's coming from the top left corner. When the film is in the camera, that means it's actually the bottom right corner because the image is recorded upside down, of course. So if this is the window right here, this is the top of the film, I pull the dark slide out, the light leak is coming from down here. It's coming from the bottom of the camera, from the lower right corner. That makes no sense to me. That's the dark side of the room. There shouldn't be a big light leak problem. If there was going to be a light leak problem, it would probably come from the top because that's where the light's coming from the window, but it's coming from the bottom. So that leads me to my hypothesis. Where is this light leak coming from? Now there's two options really here as far as I can tell. One, the light leak is actually coming from the film when it's manufactured. In other words, I'm buying the film with a light leak already in it. But I'm trying to trust New 55 that they wouldn't let that happen. I'm sure they got their quality control down. They're not going to let the film leave with a light leak. So that leads me to the hypothesis that I think is probably the answer. So I believe that light leak is actually happening after the processing has begun. So here's what I think is going on. I pull this out of the Polaroid holder, and that begins the development process. One thing I do is I tap the edges of the metal clip, and that loosens it up a little bit so that it's easier to come off when I go to drop it in the fixer. And that's something I actually saw on New 55's website. So that's something Sam Heiser actually shows you how to do. I think he calls it the tip-tap technique. Maybe when I do the tip-tap technique, it jostles this just enough to open up a little gap here, and then some light leaks in. The light leak would then be coming in from just the lower left corner of the metal clip. So it would make sense that if I loosened up that clip, that's where the leak would come from. Also, if these granules on the film are from the developer chemical, that gets spread across it, you know, the pod in there that breaks and spreads the chemicals across, if those granules are coming from that, then it would make perfect sense that the leak would have to happen after I did that tip-tap technique, because the chemistry is already streaked across the film, those granules are deposited, then the light leak begins. That's all I can think of. Now, what the hell do I know? I didn't manufacture the film. I don't know where the granules are coming from. I don't even know what those granules are made of. So it's difficult to say if I'm right. Now, before you leave a comment suggesting it, I am certain that the light leak is not actually lens flare. And I know that because on a couple of the exposures, I did shield the lens and it had no effect on the light leak. I'm also certain that the light leak is not actually light on the subject. Because I'm looking at the subject when I take the exposure. There's no light streaming in through the window. There's no granules casting shadows on the glass. It's definitely on the film. Now, I would like to keep taking exposures to troubleshoot this, because nothing drives me nuts like this kind of problem where I just need to keep working on it until it's fixed. I would love to keep going, but the light has come on the other side of the building and it's now coming through the window, so I got to call it quits for the day. But maybe that's a good thing. Maybe I should get a good night's sleep, because right now, I'm feeling pretty freaking frustrated. All right. Let's see how much expensive ass sheet film I can screw up today. All right, so my plan today is basically just to keep the film packs in darkness as much as humanly possible. So when I'm not using them, I'm not going to leave them out sitting on my table. I'm going to put them back in their box. And then when I do the exposure and start the development, I'm going to lay it under a towel or something just to make sure there's no light leaking in through the clip at the bottom. Who knows if it's actually going to help? I'm skipping the tip-tap technique and also keeping it under a towel until it's done developing, and especially the bottom clip part, because I think that's where the light leak's coming in. And I hope I'm right about that. Reaching my breaking point. I don't know what the hell is causing this light leak. This is beyond frustrating. Aside from the fact that it's costing so much money, it's just driving me insane that I can't figure out where this light leak's coming from. I guess the good news is I don't think I'm actually doing anything wrong. My exposure's coming out good, both on the negative and the print, so that's all fine. It's just this one light leak. Now, there is one thing I can do to help narrow this down, which is I could process a sheet of unexposed New 55. And that would at least eliminate the camera aspect of it. I would know it's not coming from the camera. And if it does have a light leak on the unexposed New 55, then I'm done taking pictures and I'm going to call Sam Heiser, because it must be with their film. It's going to cost $15 to do that little troubleshooting action, but I think my sanity is worth 15 bucks because I'm about to smash something. This just feels wrong. No light leak. Shit. Well, that sucks. It means I'm not going to get a refund on my film. Evidently, my hypothesis about the light leak coming in through the metal clip at the bottom of the film pack was not correct. Shame on me for doubting New 55's quality control. But that means the light leak must be coming from my camera. So, with a heavy heart, I returned to my camera in search of that pesky light leak. Again, I searched every seam, connection, everywhere I could possibly think of the light might be coming in, focusing, of course, on that bottom right corner. Now, I couldn't find anything glaring, which is frustrating, of course, because it'd be nice if it was just an obvious, oh yeah, there's a big old hole right there, but that's not the case. I even checked the Polaroid film holder itself. And lo and behold, I found a tiny, tiny, tiny little pinhole light leak in the corner. I figured this must be it. So I sealed up the edges of the Polaroid back using some black tape and tried it again. Now this next exposure with the sealed up Polaroid back still had a light leak, but it was toned down. So it seems I was on the right track. So that tape did help, but it didn't eliminate it completely. And so, all I could think now to do is to drape my dark cloth over the camera when I take an exposure. I know it's a ridiculous workaround and that's a poor reflection on my gear that I even have to do that, but it did solve the problem. With the dark cloth draped over the camera, the light leak was gone on 2 exposures, so I was able to replicate it. So I guess that's good news. I can get exposures without light leaks. Ended up with 2 good exposures, one with the single feather and one with the double feathers that I'm very happy with. So those are done. That's the good news. The bad news is I got a light leak in my camera. I'm gonna have to figure out where that's coming from so I can seal it up. But at least for now, I know I can finish this project by draping the dark cloth over my camera, and I should be able to get good results on the final frame of my triptych. This has been a frustrating couple of days, as I'm sure you can imagine. But at least I know the source of the problem, and hey, it's not like it costs a lot of money to figure this out. All right, well, the Bison Head is next. I'm excited about that one, but I think I'm going to take a day off. In dealing with a much larger subject, I had to make some adjustments to the backdrop, starting with pushing the stands out wider that were holding up the glass. And because the bison skull is so much heavier, I was worried about the strain it was going to put on the glass. So I cut a wooden dowel to just the right length and propped it up underneath to hold the bulk of the weight, which seemed to work perfectly. And because this subject has so much more depth to it, I had to think about how I might want to adjust my aperture. You know, the feathers are pretty straightforward because they're such flat subjects, but on a deeper subject like this, the depth of field becomes much more critical. All right, well, I knew this subject was going to be much more difficult than the feathers because it's so much bigger. And I'm running into the exact problem I was worried about, which is it's too big for the glass. So I can't get a shot without the props holding up the glass, and also I'm getting a reflection from the window in the glass because it's so much bigger. So I'm going to have to figure out a plan B. I think I'm going to have to skip the glass completely and find some way to prop this thing up just floating in the air. Maybe I can cut some dowels to hold it up in three spots or something like that. So I guess that's going to be today's challenge. In order to do this right, I would need something that was the perfect height and wouldn't cast too much shadow under the skull. So I couldn't do anything big and bulky under there. Now my first thought was to use some beer bottles, which I know is perfectly on brand for Nick Carver. So I grabbed some beer bottles and they worked surprisingly well. I put them under the back of the skull to hold up the weight in the back, and then I just put the wooden dowel under the nose to hold up the rest of it. It was surprisingly stable, but unfortunately the beer bottles are just a little too big to be hidden fully behind the skull. And so I grabbed an old film developing tank off my counter and wedged that under the center of the skull. Then I would just need something under the nose to hold up the rest of the weight. How's that even? Well, there you go. That was easy. Easy peasy. How in the hell is this stand actually working? Looks like it's defying the laws of physics. And I can't believe I figured it out so quickly. Looks like my luck is finally turning around. This time I'm starting with my Nikkor 150 millimeter. It's gonna be real hard to see the ground glass. Okay, the metering on this one's a little trickier than the feathers because there's much higher contrast between the subject and the background. This is so bright white, the feathers weren't that bright. So if I get proper exposure on the skull, the background may go darker than I want it. So I'm trying to find a happy medium here. But I think ultimately I can get a good negative. I'm not worried about that. I don't think the print is going to look quite as good as it did on the other ones, but that's all right. I'm going to be using the negatives anyway. I'm also a little worried about the dark horns getting lost on the dark background because they're very similar EV. But we'll see when we do our first exposure. Well, with these prints, we finally get our first sense of the completed triptych. And I have to say, I like it. It's looking exactly how I wanted it to. Now the print, this most recent print of the bison skull came out great. It's a good exposure. But you'll notice the highlights on the skull are a little hot. What I'm realizing with New 55 here is when you correctly expose for a print and a negative, the highlights on the print just don't have as much tonal separation as the shadows do. And that kind of makes sense. I mean, the way it's getting the ink on the paper is it's taking the silver halide from the negative. So on the highlights, you would have to have very fine deposits of silver halide to get good separation in the highlights. And that's just very difficult, if not impossible to do. So this is a great exposure as far as I'm concerned on the print. The negative is a great exposure too. So like I covered in a previous video, New 55 doesn't work like old Polaroid film where you had to do a completely different exposure on the print and the negative. They're not different ISOs. You can think of it that way. You can get a good exposure on both, and I do have a good exposure on the negative. However, I think I'm going to do one more exposure just a little brighter because I want to get more separation between the horn and the dark background. They're very similar tonalities, so they're kind of getting lost on each other. And if I have a slightly denser negative, it'll be easier to distinguish those when I go to scan it. I'll have more tonal range to work with in the scan. So I'm going to do a slightly brighter exposure. It's going to result in a terrible print. The print's going to be too bright, and I know that going into it. That's fine. I'll use that negative if it gives me better control in the scan, and then I'll use this print if I plan on doing anything with the prints. But overall, I'm quite pleased with this. Things are looking real good. The slightly brighter exposure did give me a denser negative, which was easier to work with in the scan. And I got better separation between those dark horns in the background. So the negative came out great. The print, of course, came out a little too bright. The highlights on the skull pushed even further, and that resulted in a print I wasn't too happy with. And yet with this excellent negative, I decided to expose yet another frame. Same exposure settings as the last one, I just wanted to take out some of the wrinkles in the background. I felt at this brighter exposure, the background with more detail looked a little cluttered with that many wrinkles in it. So I decided to smooth some of those out, and I think it was definitely an improvement. Now, of these three exposures of the same subject, I think they all have their merits. They all look cool in their own way. And one thing I like about New 55 is even the borders are different picture to picture, so you get a lot of variety between frames. Each one looks really cool, and they all fit into the triptych quite well. I just can't decide which one I like the most, but I'm sure that will come with time. You may have seen my previous video where I shot New 55 for the very first time. That was out in the desert. And I ran into a few issues back then, you might say. This video might seem reminiscent of that, But I'm happy to say that this time around, I didn't screw anything up. I didn't forget to pull a dark slide, I didn't forget to close the shutter, and I nailed every single exposure, so I'm very proud of the fact that I did everything right. The frustrations I ran into this time around were really a tale of faulty equipment. Now, I don't know if it's the Polaroid holder or the camera, but I do intend to diagnose it and find out. I suspect it might be the camera. After all, I'm using a Shenhao HZX45-2A, which is not exactly a high-end 4x5. It's no ebony, I'll put it that way. So I'm going to find that light leak and I'm going to fix it. Despite all these frustrations, I feel this was a success. And again, I'm not quite sure which of the bison skull photos I'll end up using in the final triptych, but ultimately it doesn't matter because they all look cool and the triptych as a whole came out exactly as I pre-visualized. You know, I have to say, in photography, there are few better feelings than having a pre-visualization in mind for months and then finally bringing it to life in the real world. It's like having an itch that's been bugging you for months and then finally you scratch it. It just feels so good. And that's what I did here. So I want to thank you for joining me on this little photography on location, sort of. I do hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.